Hi, I'm Sue from Pelland Designs, and you'll know me by my Leaves Galore tools. Today, we're going to use our Leaves Galore tools to make a scalloped or serpentine edge on our quilts. And I'd like to show you the process for making scalloped and serpentine edges. This quilt behind me has a beautiful serpentine edge. So that edge just looks like an S shape. That's what I mean by a serpentine edge, as opposed to a scalloped edge quilt. A scalloped edge quilt has every curve going towards the outside. So I'd like to show you the process for making both the scalloped and the serpentine edge quilts. And you're going to follow along with the chapter in my book, Marking Serpentine and Scalloped Edges. So today we're going to work on a small board with a small piece of fabric so I can show you the technique of marking a serpentine edge for your quilt and also a scalloped edge for your quilt. We're going to picture this corner as the corner of our quilt, even if our quilt went on in this direction, much larger. The first tool that we're going to use is my quilter's chalk line. This quilter's chalk line is filled with iron erasable chalk. The second tool that I'm going to use is a Nifty Notions chalk wheel. There are many different brands of this chalk wheel. This one, the top comes off and you can fill this product with iron erasable chalk. The iron erasable chalk powder comes in a bottle, and you can add that powder to any tool that accepts powdered chalk, like this one here. You're just going to add a little bit more chalk into the body of this plastic tool, snap down the little rubber cover, and then when you pull the line out of this chalk wheel, it has chalk on the line that will then snap onto your fabric. Now, this chalk is very dusty and it can get all over your project. However, all we need to do is swipe that with a hot iron and all that chalk will disappear. I'm just going to turn over my fabric right now and start fresh with the second side. Now, I do like to mark about 1.5 inches away from the corner of my quilt when I'm making a serpentine edge. I'm going to place my pin about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches away from this edge, and also 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches away from this edge. And now I'm going to snap those chalk lines. So I'm starting on the straight line here, I end on the straight line here and snap a line, and I do it in this direction as well. Now, many people ask me if the chalk comes in other colors. It does not. The only iron erasable chalk is this white iron erasable chalk. I am demonstrating on black fabric, but realize that you can do this on most colors of fabric. The only fabric it will not show on is a white fabric. Now that we have this intersection of the two lines, we're going to find the right size Leaves Galore template to make our scalloped or serpentine edge. The quilt that I showed you earlier used this 5-inch side of my Leaves Galore template, and that's the one I'm going to demonstrate today. You will find a chart in the back of my book, Rotary Cut Applique with the Leaves Galore templates. That chart will help guide you to find the right size for the size of your quilt. When you place this tool right into this corner, you are ending your serpentine edge with an outside curve. So we're going to place the straight line of the tool here on our chalk line, and the straight line that runs down the center of this 5-inch curve right on this chalk line here. It matches here and here in order that I know I have a straight or a 90-degree angle here on my quilt. And I'm going to use that chalk wheel to mark that inside and outside curve. Now I'm going to turn my tool and do the same thing on the second chalk line. There's a straight line here running along the straight edge of the tool, and there's a straight line that goes right down the center of my 5-inch curve. That's running right over the chalk line that I marked. And now once again, I am starting with a full outside curve. Then I go in and out again. When I need to continue my line further down the quilt, you will overlap one full outside curve. So your centering line will line up all the way along the edge of your quilt. You're going to begin right here at the outside curve and continue marking. So you're overlapping one full outside curve because you've also lined up this center line. You know that you are marking that 5-inch curve correctly. So it may be a little difficult to see on your screen, but you can see that I now have this curve and this curve. I would be marking this quilt either before or after it is quilted. If I mark this before it's quilted, it's likely that the markings will rub off by the time I need them. So I do recommend that you finish quilting your quilt. Then you're going to measure the distance between this corner and the opposite corner. You're going to go to the chart in the back of the book and find the right size curve to fit that line. You may have to stretch or reduce your curves. Let me explain to you how you stretch or reduce a curve. I'm going to turn my fabric over, and I'm going to help you learn the process of stretching or reducing your curves. If you need to stretch your curve, the book explains that stretching and reducing is always done in 1/2-inch increments. So if the book says to stretch 3 curves out of the 10 curves that you're making, this is the process. You're going to start with a full outside curve. You never want to stretch or reduce this outside curve or this outside curve, because we want our corner to end up a full rounded corner, just like this. When we do need to stretch or reduce, we can move our tool as we're marking. I'm going to start marking this curve and go right down to the very deepest point of the curve, and I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to slide my tool down by 1/2 inch. I'm just doing this by eye, but what I need to keep constant is this line right here going down the center of my tool. I've slid my tool down by 1/2 inch, and I'll continue to mark my curve. When you pull that tool away, you'll be able to see that you have stretched this curve by 1/2 inch here, but it's not going to be noticeable in the grand scheme of things. When I have to reduce or stretch several curves, I will make sure that they're not one right next to the other. If I have to reduce 3 curves, for example, I'll do one here, one midway on the quilt, and one at the other end of the quilt. So this one here is showing you how to stretch by 1/2 inch. What if I needed to reduce? Let's go ahead and reduce this next curve. I'm going to place it right on the line here. Let's bring it central so you can see it. I'm going to start tracing that line. I'm going to stop at the highest point, and then I'm going to slide my tool over, staying on that line. I'm going to slide over by 1/2 inch. Your 1/2 inch can be measured right here, or from where you stopped to the center of that curve right here. So you're just sliding over from here, over from this point, over by 1/2 of an inch, this point right here. Then you're going to continue your curve. Once again, you've shortened your curve from 5 inches to 4.5, but in the grand scheme of things, that will not be very noticeable in your quilt. So this is how we fit our serpentine edges to the quilt. Let me continue on this side, and then we'll talk about scalloped edges. Serpentine edges are the easiest quilt to bind. When you sew your binding on a serpentine edge, you're going to make a bias binding. You're going to place the raw edges of the binding on that serpentine line that you marked. And as you place that binding, you're going to be stitching 1/4 of an inch away from that marked line, away from your raw edges of the binding, in by 1/4 of an inch. And you're going to stitch that a little bit at a time, adjusting that binding to go around those graceful curves. You do need to use a bias binding in order to turn your curves. Once you have your binding sewn all the way around your quilt and you've mitered that final joining seam so that the binding goes smoothly all the way around your quilt, then you're going to come back in with your tool and cut using a rotary cutter, or you can cut on that line with scissors in order to cut your 1/4 inch seam allowance away from your seam. It is going to be on that marked line. Now remember, if you did any stretching or reducing, if you are cutting with the rotary cutter, you have to also stretch and reduce as you're cutting. Once your binding is sewn on and your edge is cut along this line, you'll be able to flip that binding over the raw edges, turn it to the back side, and stitch the finished edge. So that is a little bit about how you make adjustments for your serpentine edge. Now, when you want to make a scalloped edge on your quilt, first you're going to mark a serpentine edge. After you've marked your serpentine edge, you're going to slide your tool down by 1 full leaf shape. The dash line on the tool follows the line that you've just marked. The centering line follows the line that was marked 1.5 inches away from the edge of your quilt, and you're going to mark all of your outside scallops. Now you can take an iron and erase this inside line, because for a scalloped edge quilt, you're only going to be following the outside line. Scalloped edges are more difficult to bind. When you are binding a scalloped edge quilt, we're going to stretch this one like we had before. When you're binding a scalloped edge quilt, you need to start sewing on your binding 1/4 of an inch away from that marked edge. When you get to this inside corner, you're going to have to take this out of your machine. So you're going to go to this inside corner, you're going to back stitch. Then you're going to take it out of your machine and cut right down to that last stitch with your scissors. Then, and only then, you'll be able to turn that binding and continue stitching around this outside curve. When you come to that 1/4 of an inch inside point, you're going to stop and back stitch, and then you're going to take it out of your machine and you're going to cut right into that last stitching line. And then once again, continue on binding. You also need to use a bias binding, but this type of binding is much more difficult than a serpentine edge because of that back stitching, cutting, and continuing it is more difficult to follow this edge. However, some quilts are worth it. So if you have these tools, you can make both scalloped and serpentine edge quilts, and these tools will help you make beautiful finished edges on your quilt.